All right, here we go. I feel like I should welcome you all to the Sundance Film Festival by the weather outside, and I was riding my bike in it. Come on, they can't get a couple chuckles? Jesus. Tough crowd. Thank you. If anyone knows Josh Braun, he is de-aged and is now sitting in the center chair. Unfortunately, Josh called about 10 minutes ago and said that Sundance selections are coming in and he is stuck trying to get a film. But Ben from his office was kind enough to, I guess, take an Uber here. How did you get here?
Yeah, I was actually doing some of the round tables here,
Okay,
so came on down.
So what I'm going to I'll give you a brief introduction to myself and then pass it down, and then we'll jump right in. So I'm Marc Simon. I'm an attorney at Fox Rothschild. I like to joke that I'm an attorney with benefits because I've also directed and produced a few documentaries, two of which have previously screened at Doc NYC, and I've also executive produced documentaries. So everything documentary I feel very comfortable in discussing and answering. My hope for this panel is not to have a dry discussion walking through the numbers of like your typical questions of, what does a sales agent charge? And I want it to be fresh. I want to hear the panelists' perspectives on new issues and thoughts that are very practical for the filmmaker, things that I hear. So those are the questions that I'm going to be peppering in and asking them about, trying to make it very practical for you guys. And don't feel afraid to ask a question that you think is dumb or that you think is challenging. Whatever it is, that's the forum for this, to have a live and open discussion. So with that stated, I'll pass it down. Ben, if you could give a brief introduction and how long you've been at Submarine, et cetera, that'd be great.
Sure. So I'm Ben Schwartz. I work on the sales team at Submarine. I've been there for almost 3 years, and before that I was working in distribution, so right on the other side of the sales world. So I work on...
Where were you in distribution?
I worked at Radius, which was a branch of the Weinstein Company. And I work on all of our sales titles every year, and I also head up our tracking and acquisitions. So I'm out there trying to find documentaries, and so going to festivals, going to forums, and all kinds of meetings with filmmakers to try to put together our slate for every year. So I work on both aspects of the sale and acquisitions for what we do.
Hi, guys. I'm Scott Kaplan, and I currently, I guess I've been in rights licensing business in television and film rights for close to a decade now, but most recently was at Film Buff and then Gunpowder and Sky, and have now been, for the last year and a half, running international sales and licensing at Gravitas Ventures. So we are one of the largest, at least on a volume basis, film distributors in North America. We distribute probably over 100 documentaries a year and about 400 films a year. Maybe 10% of those being theatrical, 90% being exploited in the digital space. And like Mark, I'd really like to turn this less into, I don't want this to be a typical panel. I kind of want to make this more of like a party. So if you guys want to get up and start dancing and doing keg stands on the stage, everything's kind of above board.
So the way we're going to break this down by topic is the first area I'm going to dive into will be the shortest, and it's going to be more about production agreements, and I'll sort of hog a lot of that discussion because it's lawyerly more so than sales-based, and I'm going to try to get through it quickly, but I am going to look for input from you guys. And then we're going to talk about sales agency agreements and the sales agency process, and then we'll talk about distribution agreements and the distribution process. And again, all with the focus from the filmmaker's perspective, but lessons learned from the sales agent and or the lawyer perspective. So with that said, I might throw some items out to you guys, and if you don't know, I can jump in. So first point is obviously documentary filmmakers, you need releases from your subjects. But very often now, I am being asked about life rights for documentaries, either for purposes of subsequent rights because the documentary filmmaker thinks that there might be a derivative film based on it, like a scripted film, or not. And I'm curious if either of you have come into those sorts of issues with filmmakers who have an issue with life rights or don't know what to do about just getting a release for the documentary versus a life rights deal. Have you guys encountered that at all?
Yeah, I mean, we have done a number of remake deals for our documentaries, and certainly having the life rights from the beginning can be very helpful versus just a release for the documentary. And we've definitely run into issues where there's a lot of interest in the narrative remake rights, and the filmmakers do not have the life rights of their subjects. And there can be potentially a remake just based on the documentary, but it does make things much easier when the life rights are kind of together from the beginning with the film. And, like a film like Three Identical Strangers, which we had at Sundance this year, and the filmmakers, had the life rights to the subjects, and, we did a remake deal for that film based on those. So certainly if looking toward just beyond the doc into any sort of adaptation or scripted adaptation can be an important aspect.
And what about so I would consider life rights part of the bundle of underlying rights. And what about other underlying rights? Like, how important do you think it is if a documentary filmmaker has an option to a book that is, the foundation for the film and items like that?
Yeah, I think, it depends how closely the film is based off of the book, or, just using it more loosely. But, we always recommend that if possible, you should be optioning as a book if that's influencing your filmmaking. And that can also help eventually if there's any sort of adaptation. So, I think one thing that can come up is if you don't, for example, option the book and then the film comes out and suddenly someone else options it and can then use that to do a scripted adaptation, if you want to make sure you're protecting your idea and you're, and be thinking kind of forward with that.
Scott, anything?
Yeah, I mean, 99% of the time we're dealing with finished films and are not so close to the actual production side. So when a lot of these conversations are happening, but there are circumstances. There was a documentary that comes to mind that we distributed, not Gravitas, but I distributed at a previous company called Burt's Buzz, which is about Burt Shavitz, who created Burt's Bees, the amazing brand, and he was just such an incredible character, and we got a lot of interest after the film was pretty successful, and it was highlighted in the New Yorker and got some nice buzz. We released it theatrically, and there was some interest from TV networks in doing reality series about Burt, and the director and producer had to kind of scramble to go back to try to put this deal together, and and I think it would have been better just in general if you're making a documentary and you're elevating a story, it's oftentimes, if possible, to get those rights and to be able to get not just the adaptation rights to a narrative feature, but also the rights to reality series or anything else that might come downstream, to at least be have a first look as a producer on that can definitely help expand the scope of your project.
So the reason I'm asking this is for the filmmaker, at the end of the day, if you have these rights, you're going to have a lot more leverage and you're going to be in a lot stronger position if you have a successful film and you control not just the remake rights to your documentary, but the life rights to the subject and or the rights to an underlying book that you control. And so it's something to think about. And it also now makes you as the documentarian have a more complicated sort of checklist in your head, potentially at the beginning of a film, because here's sort of the summation. It used to be, I'm making a documentary, I need an appearance release for my subject. depending on what kind of film it is, that conversation may now be, do I want an appearance release or do I want life rights? Then the question becomes, well, if I'm getting life rights, am I getting life rights to the documentary? Am I getting life rights for a future narrative film? Am I getting life rights to a future episodic production? So we now went from appearance release to life rights, and now we went from scripted to unscripted, and then we also went from feature to episodic. So these are all different considerations to be made potentially when going out for a project. The takeaway should not be like, oh my God, what am I supposed to do? The subject matter of your documentary, to a large part, will sort of advise you. In Three Identical Strangers, that was very condensed. There's two living individuals, and so if you think you're making a commercial film about this extraordinary story, we're not talking about getting the life rights to 6 or 7 people. That's more of like a survey doc. So that analysis is easier. And your reps, that's something you can talk about. I get calls from my clients, how should we think about this? And sometimes I will structure a deal where it's an appearance release for the documentary and an option to option the life rights down the road for either a film or an episodic. So let's move away from there. And curious if you guys have, when it's come time, you have a successful film and either you're about to sell or you actually sell the film, any horror stories that come to mind that arose out of a production problem, like a filmmaker didn't have a release, or a subject tried to disavow a release, or sometimes an issue with a location, anything that the filmmakers are thinking about that they should have covered themselves during production or to be aware of in the production phase? Scott's smiling. Take it away.
No, I'm sure this has happened to you guys. I mean, we've had lawsuits, we've been threatened with lawsuits before. And by we, I mean me. I do not want to implicate my current employer. Been threatened by lawsuits before where we're releasing a documentary and someone says, you know what, I was in this documentary and I never gave them my, the permission to put me in, in a film, or, they're not telling the story. They had to get my approval, and 99% of the time these were unfounded. But certainly you want to be buttoned up. The legitimate issues that we come up with that come after production tend to be like last-minute music clearances, where there was an assumption by a filmmaker that they could clear some music, and then all of a sudden they say, holy shit, this is really expensive. Because music is really expensive, and a lot of first-time documentarians don't really understand that. And so I think you got to be really careful with the music you use, but I don't.
No, that's helpful.
Yeah, those were two of the examples I was going to use. One, and I think often is unfounded, but for example, if you have someone interviewed in your film who then you kind of like the relationship goes sour for some reason, and they no longer want to be in it for some reason, they'll often claim that, or not often, but there have been times where subjects claim that, oh, I never gave permission, I don't want to be seen in the film, and so making sure that any sort of release appearance or whatever, whatever agreement you have with a subject is buttoned up before there's any sort of exposure and kind of attention on the film. And also, I think really the biggest one that comes up with us is music clearances, where we'll get in a submission and we'll say, it will have like 5 Beatles songs in it or something, and we'll say like, have you really like priced out what this is going to be to clear it, for example, for like a worldwide release? And oftentimes, that's not the case. So, music is very expensive and definitely something to keep in mind. And particularly filmmakers will often just clear the music rights for festivals and maybe not even price out necessarily what it would be to clear it for like a Netflix release or something, or for some sort of worldwide scaled release, and then are very surprised to find out how much more it is to for clearing in perpetuity worldwide. So it's at least if there's only the budget to clear for festivals for the current music in the film, it's absolutely worth having on paper the cost of clearing the film for different levels of distribution.
Yeah, and my summary point on those 2 points are every single year I have one or more film projects that have an issue because a release for a subject was not obtained, and when it comes down to the end, whether it be the festival release or the commercial release, an individual pops up out of the woodwork. The filmmakers might have thought that they had a good relationship with that individual, or that subject had a good relationship with the main subject, and they can't believe that they're getting pushback. I promise you, it happens every year. It's happened to me for one film in this festival. So I strongly encourage you to get those releases early. Do not assume that you're going to be able to get the release later. Also, if you did not get a release from someone in like a crowd scene or in some what I call semi-private scene where there's an event happening, talk to your reps early on to say, hey, this is how I plan to utilize this subject. Is that going to be a problem? Because the answer might be no, it's not going to be a problem. There's no privacy rights that would be accorded to that individual, and it's fleeting, and or there's some other reason why it's not going to be a problem not to have a release. But sometimes you do need that release, so go into that smartly. And then with regard to the music, I am a big fan of not going to your festival premiere without knowing exactly how all the music in your film is going to be licensed and permitted at the commercial release. As Ben said, if you only have festival rights and you have not negotiated out your music rights for the actual exploitation, then you've really put yourself in a vulnerable position because you might not be able to utilize that music when it comes time to exploit it. One other point before moving away from production, and if we didn't hit anything that you have questions about, like E&O, insurance, things of that nature, we can get back to it during the Q&A. I often get questions about location releases and the need for location releases. The short answer about location releases is if anyone who is the owner of a property, whether it be an institution or an individual, has a claim because you filmed without a location agreement, that's about trespass. So unless you are going to be sued for trespassing onto a property, you're going to be okay. I'm not telling you not to use a location release, but I'm saying that you're not going to retroactively be likely having a problem unless it's a claim for trespass. So use your judgment when needing a location release. It came up today in one of my roundtables. A filmmaker asked, do I need a location release if I give my subjects a camera on their location, which happens to be an educational institution? The answer is no. You're not going on to that location. You're allowing your subjects to do their own filming in a location that they're allowed to be in. You don't need a location release in that instance. All right, moving on. So the sales process. I'm looking for a new response or new answer to a very old question. And I'm going to have a handful of follow-ups about engaging a sales agent. And I'm going to make the question broad, but you guys can answer it in any way you want. We're now in a slightly, if we had this panel 5 years ago, it would be different. There was not so much emphasis on episodic. There's not so many permutations about what your project's going to be. Filmmakers often don't know if their film's going to be a feature or an episodic. They have different ways of raising money. That's the same whether it's through grants and donations or equity. At what point, this is the old question looking for new answers, when should filmmakers seek a sales agent? And Scott, you can approach it from the foreign perspective, and Ben, you can approach it from the domestic perspective, and you guys can overlap in terms of worldwide. But I'm a filmmaker. Like, when am I supposed to talk to try to start finding a sales agent?
I think it's changed a lot in the past few years. I think, like for Submarine, for example, 5 years ago, the majority of films we were coming on board were, in post where we could see a cut, and that's when filmmakers were approaching us, and that's when we were approaching films. And that's still, I think, the majority of films we work on are at that stage. But we're certainly, particularly in this time of documentary series, looking at projects much earlier, as early as like early development. And so we take pitches from that stage, all the way to kind of the traditional seeing a cut and going from there. And that's for multiple reasons, one of which, going to the series question, is that, I think we've gotten in pitches for films that we've felt like could be a series. And so I think, like we worked on Wild Wild Country from a very early stage, and that was initially conceived of as a feature film. And we actually saw the materials and suggested that there was enough for a series. And that's the same with The Keepers and a few others as well. So, we're more and more eager to see things at an earlier stage and try to help shape what the project may look like. I'm not saying that every or even most pitch we get for a feature is right for a series, but it's certainly, and also because like places like Netflix, like to get involved much earlier, there's a rise in submissions and a rise in what we're looking for at an earlier stage.
And just one follow-up before I go to Scott. If I'm a quote-unquote A-list documentary filmmaker, I'm going to have easier access to get to you to say, hey, I'm developing something, I could use some help. But for the majority of filmmakers who haven't reached that level yet, what do you need to see from them? Let's pretend they have a good idea so that they're not wasting your time and so that they're putting their best foot forward. If they're coming in early, what has to be presented to you to impress them? What are you going to be looking at?
Yeah, so I would say there's a few things. I mean, I think having a really good written treatment is important. Something that gives us a detailed understanding of what the project is, what your idea is, whether it's for the feature or for, if it's an episodic breakdown, and, what kind of access you already have. I think that's, there's great stories out there and people have great ideas, but without access, then, it's hard to move forward. And also having some sort of sample footage makes a huge difference. I think before we come on board pretty much anything, we need to see some sort of visual material. Maybe there are some exceptions, but having something to show, again, that shows access, that shows your visual idea, that gives a sense of how the story might be told is very important. So I think when we come on board something in development or early production, the materials we're seeing to take that next step and work together is going to be the treatment and some sort of teaser.
One follow-up for you. What's a typical turnaround time? And if I'm not getting a response, what does that mean? Are they passing and they don't want to tell me? Or does it mean they haven't gotten to it? How do I navigate that? Like, I've reached out to Submarine 3 times. I don't want to be a jerk. I don't know. I've reached out to Josh. I've reached out to one of the Bens. Like, what am I supposed to do?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a fair question. We, in all honesty, we get in a lot of submissions. So, and we do look at everything. I mean, when we say that, we look at every submission, every, finished film submission, and every written or visual pitch that comes in. It's definitely worth being persistent. I think the turnaround time also varies by time of year. Like, for example, these next 2 weeks are like Sundance invite season. And in that case, we're kind of like our whole team is really focused on that. So if we're getting in a pitch for something in development like today, it's probably going to take us a little longer than kind of outside of the height of festival season. So, I think the time of year varies. The summer is usually a little quieter into early fall when we're really looking for new stuff for the year ahead. So that can be a good time to approach.
So if it's been 6 weeks or 2 months and I haven't gotten a substantive response, what should I do?
I would say be persistent and keep following up. We definitely recognize persistence and I think appreciate it. And, just keep emailing or give us a call and, we'll do our best to get back to you as quickly as possible. But, it's just the nature of what we do and the number of submissions that we do get backlogged and people are traveling and we just, don't get a chance to talk about something. So it's not necessarily that we're not interested, but just like other forces have gotten in the way.
So Scott, I'll let you be the bad guys. Ben is, being very nice and telling everyone to be persistent. When does the filmmaker cross the line in terms of the diplomacy. What should a filmmaker not do when he's trying to get his sales agent to consider a film? What pisses off a sales agent?
Yeah. Well, I mean, first off, I guess I'm not, and I'm saying this as a sales agent, I'm not entirely convinced that filmmakers need sales agents in 2018. Sometimes they do. I think if you have a project and you're looking for a network or a platform to finance that project, or you're looking for if the project requires development, then in that circumstance, yes, I think that sales agents can be very valuable. I think that if you need help with the festival submission process and you have a finished film, I think that sales agents provide great value there if you feel like you can't really do it on your own or you don't know the right people. But I think, look, I mean, at the end of the day, if you have a finished film, a sales agent is a broker. And most directors and producers of documentary films don't have the relationships necessary to broker all the right deals and make sure all the conversations are happening. But I would argue that sales agents have those relationships, but also distributors have those relationships too, increasingly in 2018. And so I think that, especially as the number of buyers domestically who are legitimate buyers, that number is going down. Okay, there have been a lot of SVOD streaming platforms that have not survived and not been able to compete with Netflix. And so right now, when you look at the number of buyers out there, there aren't that many. And any competent domestic distributor can have those conversations for you. And, again, if you have a finished feature, I'm not so sure that you need a sales agent or a traditional sales agent. I think a sales agent distributor hybrid can function well, and you're not getting feed twice, right? You're not paying someone just to have a conversation, then all of a sudden paying distribution fees on top of that. But those would be combined into one fee.
But so to follow up on crossing the line.
Yeah. On that, to answer your question. So crossing the line, I think, like Ben said, we look at everything. I think that usually a non-reply, usually is a pass, but not always. Sometimes there's like an intense, heated debate going on internally about what the value or what the correct release strategy for something could be. I think that I would be cautious because if you, I don't know if I should say this, but if you come off as a pain in the ass as a filmmaker, meaning somebody who is, really just, abrasive or, has is hard to kind of deal with or perhaps, doesn't, is a little bit too close to their project where they can't have a productive sales, productive business conversation about their film. I think that sometimes that's something that we take into account sometimes, and we'll say, this is a really cool film, but this filmmaker, seems to, require a little bit of personality management that, frankly, we don't.
No, that's helpful. I mean, I think the takeaway there is it mimics life. How are you dealing
that's a good point,
with an issue in life when you're not getting a response about something? It's the same skills that you need to.
I also think it's kind of like, look, filmmakers are in sales. They're selling their films to gatekeepers like a distributor, a sales agent, et cetera. And then those gatekeepers become salespeople who are selling those films to platforms and to networks or, eventually to audiences. And so we're all in the sales game. And I think it's just like, trying to find a significant other at a bar, right? When you come on really strong, perhaps you feel desperate and it's, not as convincing a sales pitch as coming up confidently and saying, these are the, I'm a desirable commodity and, people think I'm attractive. This is, what I have to offer. Let me know if you're interested in going on a date.
I think that's helpful. Also, hopefully, depending on where you are in your career and where your projects are, you have other advisors. Your lawyer. I have relationships with all the sales agents, and I sell films. I'm what I call agnostic. If someone wants me to sell the film, I'll do it. But I always say to my filmmakers, I'm also happy to put you in touch with any sales agents, and I'm happy to follow up with any sales agents who are not getting in touch with you. So I think it's important to also have a well-rounded team in the process. before moving on to some other questions in the sales agency process, could you guys just give us, each of you touched upon it, but just some of those internal meetings, like what, and I'm really focused on the filmmaker who's just made 1 or 2 films, how do they differentiate themselves? What is it that the sales agent's looking for? And what is that conversation like internally? Like, what if there's no A-lists on the team? What if there's no celebrities attached to the project? What if the film is clearly not the most commercial film, but it's actually really good? Like, I had a meeting with 30 West in LA who told me that they took on a project that was at Doc NYC, even though they knew it was small, because they had, in this case, a very strong relationship with the director. The director, though, had done a lot of films before, so that was the edge. How do you differentiate yourself, and what goes on in those conversations?
So I'll take this one first. I think, again, 99% of the time we're looking at finished documentary features, and we are certainly a commercial enterprise in that we're really looking at films where we can come in and say, yes, we can return value and help filmmakers, pay their financiers back and make a profit. And so that's the lens that we're viewing films through. That being said, are there passion projects where we take on, where we see something, we're like, this is just too cool, and you know what, I have real questions about whether we can make money on it. We do that all the time, but the focus really is on commercial films. And so for me, I look at a film and I say, all right, obviously, again, dealing with finished features, what's either the festival credential, what festival was this film at, or what festivals does it have the potential to get into, A. B, is it about a subject matter that is fresh or different, something that hasn't been covered recently in a big film? Does it have pacing to it, or is it just talking heads? So frequently, all I do all day long is talk to buyers. And one thing that buyers, especially international buyers, don't like is when a documentary is just interviews. They want to see, usually, depending on what the type of film it is, they want to see some real footage and drama and story, and perhaps a story arc that goes over the course of the documentary where you feel like you're watching something unfold. Not all documentaries are like that, but films that have a real good story arc to them and at times almost feel like a narrative feature in certain ways tend to be successful.
Because I want to talk a bit about the foreign in a moment. On the foreign side, what do you feel like the foreign market is looking for right now? It's a broad question, but let me give you an example of what they're not looking for. If you make a social justice movie in the U.S., it might be a very strong film. It might be at Sundance. I can tell you that the likelihood of that performing well in the foreign market is slight. Right. So if that's one end of the spectrum, that the foreign market does not want to see U.S. social justice documentaries about our little court system or our issue, what do they have a strong appetite for?
Yeah, I'd say that, when we're talking about foreign, there are 2 types. I'm going to put buyers into 3 buckets. We're going to talk about SVOD platforms who are buying worldwide rights, like Netflix or Amazon. Then we're talking about distributors, theatrical distributors, VOD distributors, DVD distributors, who are picking up all rights for a specific territory and looking to monetize those rights across their territory. And then you're talking about TV networks or streaming platforms, but for the most part, local TV networks. And the type of TV networks that buy documentaries are oftentimes the public networks in certain countries, whether it's VPRO in the Netherlands or SVT in Sweden, and so these are, and they have a certain sensibility to them. And I'd say those 3 buyers look for different things, but in general, I think, again, theatrical filmmakers are looking for something, or theatrical distributors are looking for something that is really going to, it's going to have a solid theatrical release domestically, is at a certain level of film festival, and is going to create a certain level of buzz, or is from a filmmaker that is known. They have a pretty, they're pretty specific in terms of what they're looking for in terms of the size of a film. But on the television side, I think that there's a little bit more room there, and they're looking for a story that they can show in primetime television, and it will be accessible and commercial for people and have a certain pace to it. So a film that kind of has a fast pace to it is always going to sell better internationally than one that doesn't.
Ben, when should a filmmaker seek let's talk about a completed film. When should a filmmaker seek a foreign sales agent? How do they know when to do that? If
Yeah.
let's pretend you're representing domestic and you're not taking foreign.
Yeah, we work in a variety of ways with foreign. Sometimes we have a foreign sales side of our company for certain films. We'll do, direct territory sales ourselves. I think the one thing for films where like all rights worldwide are open when they come to us, we always like to first explore those single worldwide deals with like a Netflix or an Amazon or Universal that, can buy.
Is there anyone else?
And there's all rights domestic companies that can buy the world. And
like who though?
Like Magnolia and Sony Classics and Gravitas, and there's a number that can take world rights, and they all have foreign sales divisions and do those sales themselves. So we like to explore those deals first. Sometimes filmmakers come to us and they already have an existing relationship with a foreign sales agent, and they want to have them on board from the beginning, and that's certainly something we can work with. We still like to have some sort of window to explore a worldwide deal, like, for example, just a very short window after the festival premiere to explore those Netflix or other company deals. And then at that point, we would not engage. We would only engage for North America if there wasn't a single worldwide deal, and allow whatever foreign sales agency the filmmaker wanted to work with to come on and start doing those deals. And we also, oftentimes, like, for example, at Sundance, can find a foreign deal, like, with an MG. So, like, we might sell the domestic rights to someone, and then, like, a dog wolf comes in and puts up money against those foreign rights. So they're acquiring those rights for the rest of the world, but we're like, negotiating a deal with some money on top. So, variety of ways. But I'd say the key is for us is, trying to have time to explore worldwide deals.
Before we move to distribution, I'm going to give a quick thumbnail on a sales agency agreement. In the U.S., the typical domestic fee is 10%, sometimes negotiable down. Josh Braun still talks to me less because I had a filmmaker several years ago that made me negotiate Josh down so hard, and Josh is still passive-aggressive against me because of it. True story. But sometimes, it's a strange, but the typical is 10%, unless you have a very, very aggressive filmmaker who's pushing for lower. In the foreign market, it has a bigger range. It goes up to 30%. Why is that, Scott?
If it wasn't that high, it would hard to be in business. I know that sounds obnoxious, but the amount of work and the amount of travel and the amount of relationships necessary, it's just basically work. Domestic, again, selling a film domestically, you're calling 20 people, sometimes more, but there's a finite number of relationships that you can sell to.
Isn't it also because the broadcast deals tend to be lower numbers,
Yep.
and your sales tend to be broadcast based, not all rights, right?
Tend to be, but it's not always. It's a blend. It's really turning into a blend of both. Because there's certain markets where an all rights deal is necessary because DVD is still a viable business. Like in Germany, in Japan, as crazy as it sounds to us, DVD is still a viable business, and that's a big part of those deals. But anyway, just to finish, the amount of work, like just you take one territory, like let's say France, there are, probably 40, 50 buyers that we're going to need to talk to really make sure that we're, making sure that we're maximizing the amount of value in that territory. So it's just a tremendous amount of work, and there's markets all around the world that we're traveling to on a regular basis.
What's your typical fee? I'm thinking, I've done deals with you recently. It's been less than 30, but it's not atypical to go up to 30. What do you say your general foreign sales fee is?
It depends if we're doing distribution as well, because that's the other thing. Like I said before, for one fee, we're not just, we're looking for those deals where we're selling to an all rights distributor, but let's say we're not getting a really meaningful, juicy deal from an all rights distributor in the UK. Well, then maybe we'll sell to, a TV network directly and then release on iTunes ourselves before that television window. So we, you know,
What if
in
you're
that
not a
sense, we're
distributor? If you're just
if we're
selling?
just pure sales, you know, it really depends on it. It's impossible to say, because if it's a film that's highly competitive, where it's really desirable,
Right.
our fee's going to go down.
Right.
If it's a film where perhaps we have some question marks, or we're paying an MG for that film, it's going to be a higher.
So-
It's really
So the
really
range
varies.
really is 10 to 30%, probably. It sounds as like
We've never gone below 15 to my
never
knowledge.
gone below 15.
I don't know if I've gone below 17.
Got it.
Um,
So that's helpful. So and then the term, you know, typically in a sales agency deal, it'll be 6 months to a year. I actually try to make it shorter, especially if it's around a market. I don't get too much pushback from that. I mean, the idea is we're all on the same page to go try to get this deal to happen around that market as quickly as possible. If it's earlier, you know, like more of a development stage, then it's going to be a longer term. 2 questions for you, Ben. When you guys are going out to sell a not fully formed package like an episodic, how does that look? Is Josh, is that happening on the phone? Is it in person? Is he going to Netflix? What are the assets he's showing? What's he saying about that in development project to convince them that network or that SVOD should come on board? That's question 1. And question 2, I know that your form is going to try to capture derivative rights. How important is that to you? You know, my experience is that the sales agent will let that go. I'm kind of curious where you guys are on that now.
Sure. So yeah, in terms of how we're pitching stuff in development, you know, again, having those, I think we really, if we come on board something based on some materials, we're still going to work on those materials and until the point where we feel ready to go out and pitch them to the companies that could, you know, buy a series, or in some cases, you know, going out to financiers who could, you know, finance it and not do a pre-sale. So we're approaching these companies with like a really good teaser and some sort of really good written materials. And in that stage, it's usually in person. So we're finding a time, you know, if the filmmaker, wherever the filmmaker's based, you know, maybe if they're in New York, they'll come to LA with us for like a week, and we'll set pitch meetings with a variety of companies like Netflix and Hulu.
How often do you guys set up those pitch meetings? Is it like quarterly or?
It just depends on the project. You know, it's like whenever, if we're on a specific project and it feels like the right moment to start going out with it, then we'll try to like, you know, do 1 week in LA where each day there's a couple pitch meetings and they're all kind of in one period, and then 1 week in New York where they're all in that same period, and then hopefully, you know, come to some sort of offer from there. But yeah, for those particularly with series and development projects, we like to do in-person pitches with the filmmaker there with us.
And the question about derivative rights.
Yeah, you know, we feel pretty strongly at this point in our sales agent agreements to have derivative rights. But you know, one thing we make clear to all of our filmmakers is like with our agreements, we're not acquiring any rights. We can't do any sort of deal, whether on the distribution side or some sort of adaptation deal, without your approval. So, you know, we're only there to try to find the best deal possible. And we've had, you know, a number of successes with narrative remake deals. So, you know, if if we're with a film at Sundance, there's a lot of, you know, creative execs on the ground there looking at documentaries for remake. If we're there selling the film, we don't see any reason why we shouldn't be there representing those adaptation rights and, you know, bring you anything that comes in. And it's, again, always up to you to decide if you want to move forward with that. So, you know, we're just there as your representative, and we, you know, so we do feel like we like to retain those rights as much as possible.
So I'm going to try to go through a few distribution questions, then we'll open it up for questions. So on the distribution front, and this is a similar question to what I was asking about, like when do I go to a sales agent, development versus finish? Filmmaker comes to you, you know, it's that chicken and egg issue. They're trying to get their film made. They're trying to get it financed. Now, as referenced on this panel, some buyers, the Netflix of the world and others, are coming in earlier. So as a filmmaker, how do I make that decision? Do I start trying to find a sales agent and like test the water early, because then it's like a buyout and then I'm not getting my financing, I'm not, you know, risking the market at the end? what advice do you have about navigating that question that you're in production? Maybe you've gotten some grants, you're like up and running. Do I try to go get a buyer now, or do I wait till the film's over?
I think it's, if you feel really like you have strong materials, I think it's worth approaching a sales agent. If you, are maybe have some grant money and you've started production, or you've been able to put together you've gotten development funds, and you've been able to put together those materials. I think it's worth approaching. And we certainly give feedback to a lot of things that approach us in development and say, honestly, it's a little bit too early for us to come on board. I'm not sure that the companies that really pre-buy documentaries it's gonna really work for them. But please stay in touch. Like, we do really like the project. So that's certainly an answer we give frequently. I think, if you have a clear path to finance the film through your own, relationships, or through grants, or, knowing some, getting money from various places like an impact partners or something, where you already have those relationships and there's interest, then I think, there's no reason not to move forward with financing the film and getting it made. Again, though, particularly if you have the question of like film versus series, I think it can be very useful to approach a sales agent early.
To get the sales agent's view on it.
Yeah, to at least get a view on it.
Scott, what are the key foreign markets for you to sell documentaries? And you're doing far more features than episodic, right? You yourself.
Yeah, I sold a series to Nat Geo last year, doc series, and we're doing a couple other ones, but it's like 99% of what we do is.
So what are your
features.
top 4 markets?
Top 4 for docs, I would say French-speaking Europe, German-speaking Europe, Australia, New Zealand, and Scandinavia.
But how are you
outside
selling
the
those?
North America.
Like, are you doing that on the phone, or are you going to markets? And if so, which ones?
So the way, I go to a lot of markets with my team.
What are the top 4
Top
most
4
important for filmmakers to know?
Yeah.
To say?
I mean, I don't know. See, I don't know that it makes sense for filmmakers to go to these markets.
Right.
But on the sales side, I would say it depends on the size of the film and if the film is more geared toward theatrical or not. If it's geared toward theatrical, I think that EFM is a big one.
What is that?
European film market. It's Berlin, the Berlin Film Festival in February. Sundance is a good place to meet with buyers. But again,
For foreign?
Yeah, I mean, as someone who has relationships, the big foreign theatrical buyers tend to go to Sundance. They tend to go to the big, to Toronto. Tend to go to big festivals. And so for their creme de la creme, the biggest documentaries, it's a good time to have those conversations with those guys. MIPCOM and MIPTV are very big in terms of doing licensing deals with TV networks and streaming platforms, and all rights buyers are now going to those. Those are in Cannes, France in April and in October. Those are big. IDFA is a good time for, to find kind of smaller European and foreign distribution deals. They're all good. But basically it's about, for me, usually if you have a film that's in a big festival, and Cannes as well, of course, sorry. But if you have a film that's in a big festival, then it might sell at the festival. But for big films that are not in one of the top 3 festivals, that are not in like a Sundance, Cannes, or Toronto, I think that usually the sale process can take up to 6 months, 9 months. It's a long kind of courting process, and it also has to do with the scheduling and the budgets of that buyer. Some buyers go into a market with a budget and they're ready to buy then. Some markets go in and they say, hey, we don't have budget now, but we will for late 2019 or 2020. And so you have to set those deals up early.
Last question before we open up. Ben, excluding Sundance, what are the 3 most important domestic markets for you? Because I think it's changed recently.
I mean, I'd say, Tribeca is really a very strong documentary market right now. South by Southwest is still a great place to premiere a documentary. I guess Toronto's not domestic, but Toronto's a very strong documentary market.
Because I feel like Toronto's sort of gone down as a market for selling featured docs in the last couple of years. It doesn't, to me, it's just not an active market the way like a Sundance is. It's just
I think this year though is pretty active, and I think it varies year to year, but it's still in terms of reputation and prestige and I think for us and for other sellers and buyers, it's still in that top few.
So my last question for each of you, and then we'll open it up. What if you're not at one of those top festivals? You just had your premiere at Doc NYC. You have a completed film. It's gotten love here. Obviously there's no magic fairy dust, but what can they do to try to get their film sold?
Send it to me. No, but seriously, you need an advocate. You need someone who has the relationships, and there are a limited number, but there are plenty of people, mostly based in New York, who have the domestic and international relationships capable to get your film a release and to return as much revenue as possible, or make as much money for you as possible. And there are plenty of films that we've sold that were never at big festivals. We sold we had a big 7-figure deal on a documentary that we sold to Netflix last year, and I can't say what it is, but it was big, and it wasn't at any festivals. And it really comes down to the quality of the film and making sure that you can find someone who's passionate about the film, has all the right relationships, but isn't so overloaded that they can, has a small enough slate where they will prioritize your film. And you need those 3 guarantees. And I think if you can find that, then you're in good shape.
Yeah, I totally agree. Finding the right advocate, the place that feels right. I think when we meet with filmmakers and when filmmakers meet with us, it's often clear pretty quickly if it's the right fit. And you want someone who loves the film and is going to get the film out there in the way you want it to, and put that passion into the same passion you would pitch it yourself. So we also do plenty of deals outside of those 4 festivals that I mentioned, including Doc NYC and many others, and sometimes outside of festivals completely. So the way we select a film is totally, it's if we like a film. I mean, Submarine is 8 people. We don't have any sort of corporate mandate. If we love a film and have a good feeling with the filmmakers, the festival premiere can be important, but ultimately, having that right advocate to bring it out into the world is the most important thing.
Cool, thank you. So opening it up, straight down the middle in the back. Yeah, that's you. That's it. Yep.
Yeah, it's always a negotiation. I think that there are a lot of instances where you can retain educational rights. I don't think it's template for them to always take educational rights, but they may kind of limit some of the streaming opportunities for educational.
Can you just talk about that? Because that ends up being a very sensitive issue. It's the educational now has the streaming component. Can you just talk very briefly about that?
Yeah, so we say educational, and it means a lot of different things. It means, and this is not my area of expertise, we tend to work with other partners to monetize educational. But there's theatrical engagements that are on campus, and those can be very lucrative. There's putting a film putting like a DVD in a college and university library, so that a college professor can then pay a fee, which is usually a few $100 to show that film to their class. Then there's libraries where you're actually putting the film on a streaming basis in the school's library. Right. So there are a bunch of different.
But that last one is what the Netflix of the world are sensitive about.
Yeah.
Because it's actually streaming in the university system, so they view it as competitive. And they're the big gorilla who's paying a lot of money. And so even if they're not going to exploit educational and non-theatrical, which they are not going to, they are very rigid about it. But it is a negotiation. There's one project recently where I can't recall the outcome, but we pushed back very, very hard on trying to get an educational carve-out. And I think what we eventually were able to obtain was some ability to do non-theatrical special screenings, but ultimately we were not able to get true educational for this project because Netflix came in early. They were funding the project, they were taking all the risk, and they wanted to control it. So for these filmmakers, it sabotaged the education. I mean, there is no educational traditional release distribution for this particular film. That the filmmakers, who are very sophisticated veteran filmmakers, decided that in this particular instance that the eyeballs that Netflix was offering for this project outweighed the issue of education.
That was a Netflix original, though, right?
Yes.
Yeah, and so I mean, look, on the licensing side, you don't run into that quite as
Correct.
often. And meaning, if it's a film that has been produced outside the Netflix system, and they didn't pay millions of dollars for it at a film festival, and if you do have that problem, it's a high class problem because you're probably making a tremendous amount of money on the license.
And I think Netflix is going to evolve, and we keep saying Netflix because they are very rigid on this point, and they are the big gorilla, and they're buying the most. I mean, that's actually my opinion. They're buying more than the others. So, yeah.
What would you consider fair terms when negotiating life rights for the subject?
That's a good question. So the question was, what are fair terms for negotiating life rights with a subject? It truly is all over the place. When you're dealing with a celebrity, or someone highly recognizable, and their life rights are highly sought, you're talking about purchase price that is equivalent to a book. So, in the six-figure range or the high five-figure range, and it's going to be keyed to the budget with an option fee that's equivalent to a book. So, call it, for someone more renowned, $5,000 would be cheap for that option. But if you're talking about someone who is not highly renowned and is like an ordinary person, for the first, I'm trying to clarify, not for the documentary, but for that first production that follows, i.e. the narrative, I'm hoping not to have that purchase price go above $50,000. And if it's going to go above 50, certainly not above 100. And that option price is going to be somewhere between like $1 and $2,500 or $5,000 at the most. It's very equivalent to a book. So, is it a best-selling book? Is it a celebrity? Is it a very average person? Is it like an unpublished book? And definitely, a lawyer or an agent can be helpful there. But does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. I think looking, beyond that, in terms of negotiating that with them, it just seems like saying, "Can I have life rights to you?" Seems
Right.
very daunting.
It is. The question is, like, how do you talk to someone about that? So it's about communication. As a documentarian, the conversation has something to do with this. Look, I'm not acquiring your life rights for this documentary, but I'm hoping that if in success I bring recognition to you through my documentary, I would like to have reciprocity to be the producer on your project that is the feature version, and I can only do that if I control your life rights. And it's about trust and communication with that subject. The one thing I want to add about these deals, what I just addressed was the feature version. If it's an episodic, it gets more complicated. There could be an episodic royalty to that life rights to the individual, in addition to just the option and the purchase price. And there's some back-end pieces too.
When you were mentioning film festivals before, one festival you didn't mention was AFM, and I'm curious, is that because AFM really doesn't lend itself to documentary sales, or is just, I've been to AFM, I thought it was absolutely brilliant and gorgeous.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So the question is, how does AFM, the American Film Market in LA, which just happened, fit into the documentary conversation, Scott?
Yeah, so we had an office there, which means we had a sales office, and we did a lot of business there. But so I go there, and it's a very good market for features.
Non-documentaries.
On the doc side, there is some interest, but typically the reason why it's just the folks who go there tend to be looking for genre films. They tend to be looking for rom-coms, comedies with cast, action, sci-fi, that kind of feature. And every once in a while, you could package a documentary in there or sell a documentary to an all-rights distributor. The TV networks aren't there, and the TV networks are, especially European TV networks, are a big part of the documentary puzzle still globally.
What my main question was going to be, have you two ever, or three of you, ever been in a situation where you were interested in a film and you felt it was going to do domestically, but actually an international version or selling it internationally is actually more successful than the domestic? And if so,
Question is, experience with projects that you thought were going to be domestically successful, but actually were internationally more relevant.
Yeah, definitely. There have been some films where we struggled to get any traction or any viewership domestically, and have gotten one or two big deals. There was on the doc side. I think that I can think of features where that's happened. I can't offhand think of any documentaries where that's happened. Certainly has happened though.
On the right side.
Where does online distribution, like Slate distributor, where do they fit into the?
What was the name that you said?
Pardon me?
That you identified?
Online distribution, the two companies that are out there, there are probably more, but it's Slate or distributor.
Oh, distributor. So I'm not. So the question is about online distribution and a company that I don't. The first one I didn't recognize. I don't know if either of you know it in distributor. But Ben, do you want to just talk briefly about sort of digital only, or
Yeah, I don't know if those are like AVOD, like ad platforms.
have heard
I'm
of
actually not.
distributor.
I'm
I
not
think
familiar
to
with
answer your
that.
question about online, a competent North American distributor is going to be able to fully exploit and monetize your rights online in every possible way. So that includes not just iTunes and then selling streaming rights to SVOD, but then downstream rights, meaning hopefully after your exclusive, television or streaming deal, packaging it into channels, putting them on Pluto Television, Pluto TV, and on Roku and Amazon, and Vudu's launching an AVOD platform. Vudu's Walmart's streaming products. So
I mean,
there are a lot of different ways to make money online, and a good North American distributor should be able to handle that.
I mean,
I'm talking about another side of it, that these are distributors, not selling to online distributors necessarily. They are online, in other words, you don't have an interface like we're having with you. It's all online.
Okay, so you're saying, somebody, right. Yeah, I don't know. If I were producing a film, I certainly would want to be able to get on the phone with them and say, hey, what's going on with my film?
Yeah, I think the relationship is so important to the process, like between us and filmmakers, and between distributors and filmmakers. Having that right match is really essential to maximizing the potential of the film.
What you might be talking about are kind of white label distribution deals, which are, if you really want your film to get out there, and unfortunately you weren't able to secure an offer from a distributor, a typical independent film distributor, then there are certainly ways where you can basically self-publish and pay someone a flat fee of, I don't know, a couple $1,000s, and they will put your film up on digital platforms like iTunes and Amazon.
Premiere
Instant Video.
Digital is an example.
Right, or I think.
So I'm
Giant.
getting the sign. So one last question, then of course we can talk outside. Okay, right here in the red.
Yeah, actually, it's a question for you. So how does an attorney such as yourself, you said you sell, but you also sell to sales agents. How does that whole
Yeah.
thing?
Sure. The question is, I think it's a bigger question. How do attorneys fit into the equation? And I mentioned that I both sell and work with sales agents. Many attorneys out there are are simply attorneys, and so they have relationships, hopefully, with the sales agents and can make introductions to sales agents on behalf of their filmmakers. And then they will negotiate that agreement with the sales agent, and that's where I made my little joke, not joke, about Josh. I truly had an instance where my client really wanted me to push, and Josh is someone who I did a lot of business with, and I don't think he loved that transaction. Then once we're done, we team up together. And that sales agent and the lawyer are on the team together, and they will negotiate against with the distributor. But both the sales agent and the lawyer on behalf of the filmmaker. That's very common. It just so happens that my practice, I also can act as a sales rep. And I do it in instances where it's a more challenging film, so a sales agent knows that they're not going to be able to make one sale. It's going to be multiple split rights, and they just don't. It's just not part of their mandate right now. It's just that the film's going to take too much work, so I'll do that on behalf of my filmmakers. Or there's certain filmmakers that I have very good and long relationships with, and they say, "Hey, we want you to sell our film for us. Are you comfortable doing that?" And I do that. And there's many examples of that. I said I'm agnostic, and that's because I work with so many of the sales agents that I don't want to be competitive with them. So if someone asks me to sell a film, I say I'm happy to do that. I'm also happy to make introductions to you to whatever sales agents that you want, and you can speak to them and me and come to a determination that suits you.